So it's my pleasure to introduce this panel. We're going to be talking about the regulatory perspective, and I'm going to be your co-moderator. I'm going to be moderating with my good friend and colleague for many years, Gavin Bogle. And think of us as a car. I'll be the accelerator, Gavin will be the brakes.
He just says that because I'm a lawyer.
Yeah. and what we're going to try and do is give you the regulatory perspective. A lot of what we're going to be trying to do today is introduce some of the challenges in innovation. I'm going to pick up where Kim left off. Kim talked about the challenges of the regulatory perspective slowing us down in innovation. Well, we'll talk about those challenges and how we can get around them. And we've got a panel of experts who all have some experience, and what we'll ask is for them to share their experience. But from my perspective, I serve as an advisor to the pharmaceutical industry. I serve as an innovation coach to CHOC. I often come up with physicians who ask me, hey, I've got this terrific idea. I'd like to bring it to the marketplace. And they often don't understand the regulatory landscape. So what we're going to try and do today here is do a little bit of innovation coaching for the collective. And we'd love some audience participation. If you have ideas, please tweet them, or we could pass around mics. But let me start with my co-moderator and say, what are some of the agencies? Who are the regulators?
Well, obviously, the first agency would be the FDA. And sort of everything keys off that. But there's lots of other agencies that everybody knows that get involved, especially when you start talking about innovation and regulation, whether it's the Patent Office, the NIH and their funding. There's even the EPA, within states, especially in places like California, obviously. There's numerous levels of state government that get involved in how things are done, and I think everybody on this panel and actually in the room can think of 10 more that they've interacted with. Healthcare is just that kind of field.
Right. So what we're going to do now is just go around and talk a little bit about, think about some experiences that you've had, whether it's external regulators, like Gavin said, the FDA, HIPAA compliance, or internally with your own IRBs, trying to bring innovations forward. What has been your experience? And I'll start with one of the experiences that I've had. A lot of physicians have terrific ideas in the field of, we're going to hear about devices and so forth, but I deal a lot with folks who have ideas around pharmaceuticals, and that's one of the most highly regulated areas. If you're starting with the new drug development, you have to think about getting an IND, and often the issue is who's holding the IND, right? Is it the hospital? One of the things that we do in innovation is create vehicles like startup companies to hold the IRB, to take on their risk and deal with the regulations, because usually hospitals are not built to develop new products forward, so you can build these types of vehicles. But one of the questions I often get is, well, I'd like to use this other drug and run a clinical trial. What do I need to do? And if you're not a clinical researcher, you haven't gone through this process, you may not be aware that you have to go through the IRB, get approval for the clinical trial. You have to make sure that there is an IND moving forward. And I think that one way to deal with these things is partnerships. If your institution is not doing clinical trials, if you don't have experience going through IRB designing a new clinical trial, partner with somebody who does have that experience. And that's been one of the most powerful ways to bring institutional learning. Let me pass it over to Kevin and see what your experience has been.
So I'll start with sort of early experience during my fellowship, was just getting involved in research. And I wanted to do some pig surgery, and I said, well, pig surgery, get a pig, meet with the veterinarians, go through everything. And then I met IACUC, which is the IRB for animals. And so it was, probably a 4 to 6 month long, procedure to be able to get everything approved, back and forth. And first, initially really very frustrating. I thought I was eventually going to have to get informed consent from the pig itself. But, after you get experience doing that, you work with veterinarians that can help, speed things along. I've worked with different IO cooks, and so some of them are much more rapid, than others. So really, you do need to have a place that's going to be somewhat user-friendly, but still be able to follow, all the rules. And then for me, the reality is that, for any animal work, it really should be done, one, you should have to prove that you really do need to do the work in an animal model, demonstrate, the prevention of pain. If there's any pain that's going to be or anxiety associated with it, you have to be able to demonstrate the reasons for that. And then you have to monitor for it during the procedure. And I think, prior to 25, 30 years ago, I think that, animal research, there was, it wasn't done as well as it is today. And so for me, yes, it's regulation, it costs time and money, but from that aspect, it was, I think, well worth it.
So I would say I work for a fairly large pharmaceutical company. So I guess you could say we have a fairly good number of interactions with FDA, the EMA, and other regulatory bodies across the U.S. But I guess what I would like to say, Spiro, is maybe my call to action for this group over the next couple of days is it's time to break down silos and it's time to collaborate. The time where we all think we can get it done in our own section of the marketplace or the community is over. So industry can't do it alone, academia can't do it alone, regulators can't force us to do it and expect it to get done in a quality way. Those days are clearly over. So legislative action leads to regulations, which are executed by the regulators. But just because they force private industry to do it doesn't mean it can get done. We're often faced with protocols that aren't feasible, protocols that cannot be run. We'll run them for 7 years. We'll spend a lot of money, get 25% of the study recruited, and at the end of the day, we don't have enough patients to have meaningful data. That doesn't help anybody, and it certainly doesn't help the children. So what I would like to say here is that, I think in the last year or two, Spiro, our relationship with the agencies has been much more collaborative. And when I say collaborative, I mean, they are working to protect the public health wherever they are in the world. That's their job. Our job is to invent things and to get those things to the marketplace so patients can use them. So what we're seeing now is we're seeing a lot of opportunities where regulators are sitting down with academicians, they're sitting down with patients. We've seen what the FDA has been doing with patient groups and some of the output that they've had with those patient groups, and they're now sitting down with the innovators themselves. So I know some of our study teams at Pfizer have had very positive discussions about study designs over the last year or so, and it really seems like the regulators want to work with us to provide meaningful data to those providers. So that'll be my call to action. I think later on we can maybe get into some specifics of what's happening, but I think it's time to break down the silos and really start collaborating together.
I totally agree with Charles. I think that FDA has become much more open to collaborate and call the public for their opinion. Namely, the recent initiative out of the FDA, the Benefit Risk Assessment Group, involves patients and families to understand, what is the level of risk that a patient and their families are willing to take. So with that, I totally agree with you. I think that it has become much more easy to work with the FDA, and they encourage you to start talking to them. As soon as you have an innovative idea, early on, start talking to FDA. Don't be afraid. They are actually responsive and will get back to you. So I'm part of the Innovation Institute that is focused on pediatric surgical innovation. So we have a very ambitious role to make pediatric surgery more precise, less invasive, and pain-free. So as you can see that we do a lot of regulated projects. So we work with the FDA, and we're also one of the designated centers by the FDA for pediatric device innovation. And in that role, we're kind of the catalyst between the industry, the small businesses, to invite them to come to us if they want to be facilitated to talk to FDA or get regulatory advice. So we have this incubator space that has made it more or less easy to kind of work with the regulators. Having said that, we want also to see some improvements, because the only 3 pathways to markets that are available for pediatric devices, and I can only speak to pediatric devices, are the same as the ones that are available for adults. So we do want to see a dedicated pathway, regulatory pathway, specifically for children, so we can make these life-saving devices that children need available to them.
My name is Matt McMahon, and I'm from the National Institutes of Health. We're not a regulatory agency, but we're kind of the $30 billion gorilla of the biomedical research world, the largest funder of biomedical research in the entire world. And what we're really doing, we're not just paying researchers to do basic science research. It's really part of our core mission to make sure that that information is transferred into products and services that really help patients. And everybody wants safe and effective therapies to be out there in the world. So what are we doing at the NIH to really help make that happen? Many of the things we're doing are very well aligned with some of the things the other speakers have been mentioning. But I'll just mention two really key areas, because what we do mostly is we're working directly with those innovators that are funded through NIH. And it's really about communication and collaboration. So that pathway that those innovators has to take to get into the market and develop a product is a really long and complicated process. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to set up mechanisms that really tie those innovators early with mentors and people who have traveled these paths before, because it's really by working with people that have experience traveling the regulatory path that really helps them get to the market faster. So that's one way. But another really critical component that we've found over and over again is helping those early stage inventors really understand the unmet medical need that they're trying to attack. And although that's not directly part of the regulatory process, it's really critical to successfully navigating your product with the FDA. Because we find that that's really the root of a lot of the stumbling blocks that people have, is they have to be able to really communicate with patients and with doctors and with clinicians at a very early stage to try and understand how that product that they're developing is going to fit into the medical world. And so we have a number of programs that help inventors make those connections. So I would say it's really about communication and collaboration, both with the FDA and other agencies like the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, because ultimately who's going to pay for these innovations is also directly tied to the regulatory issues also. So NIH is really trying to partner with other agencies and partner with the innovators to really smooth that pathway along.
Hi, I'm Jessica. Maybe actually teeing off on that, I'd mentioned the collaboration between NIH and NCATS and FDA to survey physicians as well as patients in terms of unmet needs in pediatrics. So that's an effort that's currently underway. We're as well a part of the Pediatric Device Consortia. And so I co-direct that FDA-funded accelerator at Children's Hospital, Los Angeles, and so we're involved in that. And it'll be, I think, a very powerful message to the community for new product, to focus on product development where it's meaningful. I think I would add, so we advise a number of companies as well as our own innovators that are looking to commercialize their ideas. And so we interface with FDA a fair amount, and we've found that they are very open. I certainly echo that, and very engaged. And in fact, they really want to work with us in a very iterative way. So as soon as we make progress, they just want an ongoing dialogue with us, which is, which I guess I did not expect that kind of feedback. One thing I'll add, because I had kind of the tech transfer function at Children's Hospital Los Angeles, so I deal with IP as well, is kind of the interesting balance between trying to get a product through FDA through the path of least resistance, which is to say that there's a substantially equivalent technology that is out there, and then balancing that with the claims you're making with the patent office, which is your device is different and innovative for various ways, and kind of balancing those two arguments. And I guess the point there is to make sure that the innovation doesn't affect safety, right? And so that's an interesting kind of tug and pull, I think, in thinking about commercializing and interacting with the different agencies that perhaps thankfully don't talk to each other all that much between USPTO and FDA.
So I guess just to pick up on that, I would say one of the things I tell people is, you know, the patent system works it goes to specifics, and the specifics that they're after are often very different than the regulators are after, and that's what enables the two things to work together. And actually, I'm going to point out, I used to work for a large pharmaceutical company that was purchased by Pfizer. And I'm actually sitting here right now, and I thought of, and I was a patent attorney there, and I did regulatory work there. In all the years that I worked there, I never once heard the term pediatric. Not a single time ever. And I look up and I see Dr. Thompson, who's the global lead Pfizer Pediatric Center of Excellence. And one of the question that just came to mind while I was sitting here is wondering, I know a lot of the changes, Nancy Goodman had some great effect on the FDA, but I'm really curious it seems to me almost a sea change in thinking at Pfizer to have a center of pediatric excellence. And I guess I'd be curious in how that came about.
Well, thank you. I didn't plant that question, actually, but thank you for asking. So, you know, as I mentioned in my earlier comments, things have literally changed monumentally in the last 2 years. Most people don't think of Pfizer as a pediatric company. Many people at Pfizer don't think of Pfizer as a pediatric company. But when you start looking at the volume of pediatric work that we have 50 assets that have a pediatric clinical development program. We have almost 100 clinical trials in children that are either planned or ongoing. So we are a pediatric company. We don't have a pediatric team, or we didn't until a year and a half ago, who is assisting those teams in writing plans that could be operationalized, plans that are feasible, in building relationships with many of the hospitals that are represented here today, so that we can not only find sites to do the studies, but we can actually get that early expert feedback, which we hear all the time from our academic partners. Don't just come to me with a trial that I know I can't do. Come to me when you're designing the synopsis and the plan. Let us give you our expert input on how to write a plan that can be done. Let's talk to patient groups. You'll see ICANN out there. Please stop by the booth. You'll see patients and families. We heard about them earlier today. How do we involve them in that process? How do we create a protocol that patients want to be in, that parents are willing to put their children in? The regulators can force us all they want to do studies, but if your academic researchers aren't willing to run them at your institution, if parents aren't willing to put their children in them, we're not going anywhere with these studies. So we all need to work together. So we approached our chief medical officer about 3 years ago. We showed her what was going on at Pfizer, how nobody was looking at pediatrics as an entity, and she gave us an opportunity to get started. We now have 5 people on our team. 3 of my colleagues are here. We are assisting all of our development teams now in writing better protocols. We're developing relationships with children's hospitals around the world. We're going to be building an expert panel where we're going to be bringing in your colleagues to help us write better plans. So all those things are brand new. J&J is doing something very similar. Novartis is doing something very similar. There is a sea change. And not only is it happening in industry, we have to start with our own house, right? You know, you build the village, but you got to start with your own house. We're also working at the same time with regulators, with academicians, with patient and family groups to make sure that we're all connecting. You know, we had a meeting about a year ago with 60 of the world's leading academicians, clinicians, industry folks, regulators. It was a clinical trial summit. It was held in DC, and it actually was a landmark summit. It was the first time a group like that had ever come together, and they decided as a group unanimously that we need to move forward and build a clinical trial network for children. A network that academics can access, that they can provide their expertise through a non-biased third party, that industry can use to help get some of the trials done, that regulators can use for non-biased feedback, and that effort is now moving forward. So those are the things that are starting to change in the environment. Hopefully we can actually make a difference.
So speaking as a pediatric device advocate, this is exactly what we want to see happen in industry, in medtech industry. So the Orphan Drug Act became law in 1983. So I think that as a result of that, if you agree, that's why we see that, you know, pharmaceutical companies such as Pfizer have pediatric sections. But you don't see that in large medical device companies. So that's exactly what we want to see. So we're way behind in that, you know, the medtech industry is way behind. It wasn't until 2007 that the Pediatric Medical Device Safety and Improvement Act became law. So look at it, you know, from 1983, when you guys had the opportunity of all the incentives that became available to you, to 2007. So we have a lot of catching up.
So we're running a little bit out of time. We'll take one question in the back.
Hi, I am Jagjeet Teji from Chicago Lurie Children's Hospital. Beautiful conference. I was here 2 years ago and was looking at the announcement from last year. Enjoyed parents groups, and I think with all the passion we think about innovations, and if you can't reach the patient or the parent, it's default. But then to last panel that we had, the question to the organizers or the CEOs would be, would they give the employees the time enough to talk to the patients and be able to touch them? But perspective to this panel is that pediatrics innovation is lagging behind. I am a neonatologist, and there's a ICU, nice isolate giraffe, which is being used, which is the best in the world. However, the rest of the appliances, instruments, monitors are from adult medicine. And why is it this way? Babies become adults one day, and if you don't raise them well, if you don't take care of them, there's disease. And can we reduce that implication of using medications which are used for adults? And can we make them healthier children, healthier moms, healthier population? And maybe when we control all these risk factors, we can live up to 125 to 150 years.
Right, that's an excellent question. So children are not small adults. We all know that. We know it from a scientific perspective. We know it from a regulatory perspective. It's absolutely essential that we, as we think about innovations, and again, I want to use the analogy as we're driving innovations, you don't want a car without brakes. Safety is paramount. You also don't want a car without an accelerator. A lot of investigators have a fire in the belly. They've identified a new drug, or perhaps they want to reposition an adult drug. They want to bring it to pediatrics. We absolutely need that regulatory framework so we don't crash the car in our hurry to bring a new drug to the market. But at the same time, there's terrific challenges. And in the last few seconds, Gavin, do you want to say something about the challenges in bringing pediatric, or maybe Charles, whoever wants to pick that up?
So you're absolutely correct. So we've made amazing progress in children in general, to the point where half the medicines we use now, half, have prescribing information in the label pertaining to children. If you go to the NICU, however, that number is 10%. So the majority of medicines being used in the NICU on neonatal patients don't have prescribing information in the label for children. That's unacceptable. So the question is, how do we move forward? So there's something called the International Neonatal Consortium. If you're not familiar with that, I would encourage you to Google it. It's a Critical Path Institute. It just launched in May. It's an amazing group of cross-functional individuals who've come together, including regulators, to tackle some of these major problems in the neonatal space. How can we move innovation forward? We're looking now at the top 3 to 5 issues in neonatal medicine and looking at how we can actually move some of those protocol designs forward, look at how to maybe basket some protocols so we can get people working on the same similar protocols together. So Google it. If you have any questions, just come to me. I'm a member of the committee as well.
One quick comment on it does really feel like things are changing so far as innovation in medical devices, and I just think back to when I was in training or shortly thereafter, that whole idea of innovation and trying to come up with new devices and products was just not even discussed. And so maybe it's a little bit institutional specific. But there's St. Jude, was a huge multi-billion-dollar company. I got a call in the fall. They wanted me to meet with their new director of pediatric device development, which, you know, it's that is something that's very, very new for, for this field. And so I think people are starting to recognize that there's, there's a potential, there's a market, there's 75 million kids in the country. And then the final thing, you actually have 3 representatives from different device consortia from around the country. So there's 7 pediatric device consortia. And so the FDA, I think, really is a different place. They are incredibly user-friendly. Things can take, a prolonged period of time, hopefully for good reason. But I think, as an example, is next month the FDA is flying all the device consortium members down to Atlanta to get together with industry, with regulators and everybody, just to see how we can continue to advance this field.
Thank you. And with that, we'll wrap up. I want to thank this terrific panel of experts. Each of them are experts. You heard about device, the consortia. Jessica's part of that, and you heard from Kevin. He's available partner. I mean, if your institution wants to do something in the device sector, if you're interested in therapeutics, we got experts here. Gavin can help you with legal advice. I think we want to create this resource for this community, and folks like this, I want to really thank them for taking time to do this panel. Appreciate it. Okay.